Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jason Dean, Film Fanatic. Thanks to everybody for their support the last couple months and helping this channel grow, and it's been a blast. Haven't done too many of these shows, so I'm super excited. I got my buddy here, Emmett, and we have a mutual deep love for film. We have a long history. We've known each other for a very, very long time. I mean, it goes back to when we used to work in a restaurant together, and he was a very little man, very little
Yeah,
guy.
well, even before I worked there, it's like
Yep.
my dad would come in with me in the morning and get breakfast at the restaurant, and then I started working there when I was 13 with Jason.
And then I think shortly after, like your brother Crockett started working
No, I
for a
don't think
little
he
while.
ever worked there. He never really got into the restaurant work, but
And so, like I said, we have an incredibly long kind of history together, and it wasn't until like years and years later that we kind of reconnected and started playing music together, and now we have a band, Split Willow, which is a really great band, and it's all mostly original bass material, and it's pretty much Emmett's baby, and it's been a really great learning experience. Working on all this new material, and I remember there was a time too where we kind of were in different spaces, and you moved down to Florida for a long time, and I remember that time like it was yesterday when I was helping to run an open mic at Fog. You've talked a lot about Fog in a lot of these shows, with my ties with Ashley Seelig and all the shows we've done. And I was helping at that time. I was helping out playing drums in this for this open mic. And I remember Emmett, you were like cooking there, I believe.
yeah,
And
yeah,
you came, and I hadn't seen you in this like quite a few years, and I knew you had been playing guitar, but I hadn't heard you play in years. And then I remember you came after you got done with your shift, and you played at
yeah.
the open mic,
Still in
and
my kitchen clothes.
I was like, wow, like this guy is going places. Like came back a serious monster, and then you were playing a lot with the Midnight Riders, Will Neal's band, and in the area that was that band was a real big deal, and still is. You were playing guitar, I believe, for that band for a long time, and then fast forward quite a few years after that, you were started running an open mic at Rock Harbor
Yeah,
in Rockland, Maine, and I think that was like Wednesday nights or something like that. And then at the time, Rock Harbor was having music all the time, Fridays and Saturday nights, and I remember like that. There was on a Thursday. You called me on a totally like last minute thing, saying if I'd be interested in playing with you on a Friday night because the band had canceled. That was scheduled. The band that was scheduled canceled. So I was like, yeah, let's do it. And there was no plan. We didn't talk about. It was totally seat of my pants, and I was like, yeah, great. Let's do it. And so we played, and it was the first time I met Anthony Marsh, who plays bass, a great friend. He plays bass in Split Willow also. And we set up our stuff, and I think we're basically saying, hey, so we'll do some Dylan covers, Bob Dylan covers, and maybe some Grateful Dead, some classic rock hits. And we were setting up, and in about maybe 2 minutes before we went on, I remember you turned to me, and he's like, "So what do you want to call? What do you want to call the band?" And for some reason, a green light went off, and I was like, "Hey, Mullet Makers." And then that was it. And then that name stuck for like probably 3 or 4 years.
yeah. I think it was like three or 4 years. It was a while.
And and it's changed and morphed since then, and evolved to probably a more original based project, and it's now Split Willow. And so, and that's at least for my from for my life now, like that's been definitely the most the busiest project that I've been involved with, at least for this past summer and this year, and it's been a great experience. But is there any other things you want to add to your musical background, or how the kind of the shift, how it shifted over the years?
That pretty much covers it. Yeah, getting back from Florida and starting to play some open mics with you, and then we did some gigs with Red, and
Right.
and JD, and that was a crazy ride being in that band.
Yeah. I think that might have been before the Mullet Makers.
That was like
Actually,
just before,
right?
Yeah, because I was still playing with Midnight Riders, and then I was trying to get that other project off the ground with Dave Butler and my girlfriend at the time,
Right. Yeah, I remember
Georgina.
that project we had with Red from that was a wild experience.
Yeah.
But I remember after we had some good experiences after that, and I think there was like, I don't know, a little bit of a bonding thing that happened, and then we kept in touch after that group kind of folded due to just incredibly crazy circumstances. And I remember after the Mullet Makers was going for a while, and we started to kind of get some traction. We were always friends and stuff, but we never like spent, a lot of time hanging out per se. And I remember at one point, we were playing a lot of festivals, and I remember, I think we were playing a festival somewhere like a couple hours away, and I think I
Probably
was driving
up in Harmony.
Yeah, probably in Harmony. I drove you back to Camden, and I think the gig was done on the earlier side, and you had said, "Hey, you want to go out for some beers?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure." So we went to across the street to Cuzzy's, which is, a great, I guess consider it a
Local
dive bar.
watering hole.
It was right across the street. So we went over there after our gig, and I had just seen, I think I had just seen Ari Aster's Hereditary, and I remember talking to you about that, and then we started talking about Robert Edgars, who did The Northman recently, and Bewitch, and we were talking about
Lighthouse.
that in The Lighthouse, and we were talking about movies, and then you started talking a lot about Stephen King, and then suddenly we were like, I remember before I knew it, like 3 or 4 hours went by, and I totally lost track of time. We were just like totally talking about movies, and I had no idea that you had like such a deep love for film and a lot of horror literature, and you were so well read and versed in a lot of that stuff, and I remember that's kind of how, like, I don't know, like that was the experience that like really brought us together even more.
Yeah.
And since then we've like gone to see a lot of movies.
Kindred spirits as far as the getting our pants scared off.
That was like the connection. It was cool, and then since then we've gone to the movies a lot and seen a lot of movies together. So
we
was
saw
very cool.
both of the It movies, or maybe it was just the second one that we saw together.
Yeah, I think it was just the second one,
which was kind of a disappointment.
So, and we just I remember some of the movies that we saw that I remember being they were really great experiences. We saw the remake of The Invisible Man.
That was cool.
We went into that really cold, and then also The Joker.
Yeah.
That was amazing. And then fairly recently we saw Ty West's X, which I think is probably one of the best movies that's come out in recent time in regards to the horror genre. Very much a very...
The way the director built tension in that movie was so great. That scene with the alligator near the beginning of the movie.
Where almost really nothing happens, but it just creates this mood and this like tension, and there's no dialogue. And very much, I'm very much looking forward to the prequel version of that film, or for that film, and and it was just great. And so we have that, that's brought us together, and we were talking about a month or two ago about doing this show, and I know you have like a deep love and deep knowledge of all things Stephen King, and I do love a lot of his stuff, especially the earlier adaptations of his films. So we decided to make the show more or less based around that.
Yeah.
So you want to, I don't know, talk about like maybe when like I don't know, when you got bit by the bug of horror when you were a kid, like how that happened,
Oh
or
man, it happened at such a young age. You know, like it probably started when its roots are probably in when I was like 3. I think probably the first time I
wow.
saw it starts with like loving fantasy and being introduced to the 1970s animated version of The Hobbit, and then also loving dinosaurs and getting into the Jurassic Park when that first came out, and because there's definitely horror elements to that movie, and I've always been of the mind that horror is just fantasy, and it's just dark fantasy.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it definitely Tolkien is a huge influence on my love of horror. And then later on, when I was a little bit older and learning how to read, at a higher level, probably Goosebumps and
Right.
and also the Alvin Schwartz Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark.
Yep. Yep.
And those specifically the illustrations in those books that are Stephen Gamble is the guy who does did the illustrations for those, and they're just super dark, ink blotty kind of charcoal and pencil, black and white drawings that are
Very kind of like a nightmarish.
super nightmare, verging on sometimes gory, hyper detailed stuff, but plays a lot with shadows and negative space too, and huge influence on just my love of horror and the way my brain works too.
Right.
Negative space specifically is like.
Was it kind of like a thing of where, I mean, you discovered like a lot of horror-based literature at a young age, but was it like that for films, like as well? Seeing things on cable growing up.
Yeah, So, Are You Afraid of the Dark?
Mm-hmm.
I didn't grow up with cable, so the only cable that I got to see was over at friends' houses or at my grandmother's house when we go visit her. But yeah, things like Are You Afraid of the Dark? And then as I got a little bit older, watching the Sci-Fi Channel and catching episodes of X-Files.
Mm-hmm. 'Cause for me, it was, I'm an old man, so it was like the VHS thing was my beta, the tail end of beta. That preceded, that was before VHS.
Right.
And then it was VHS. That was like my introduction to horror films and movies in general, and then eventually cable. But pretty similar to my background. I remember in middle school, first like reading Edgar Allan Poe, and that was when we had to do like a school project, and that's kind of what started kind of my fascination with all things horror. And I was, when we talked about doing this show, I'm pretty familiar with a lot of Stephen King works, his books and stuff, and I'd seen a bunch of his films growing up, but when we were talking about the show, I started doing a little bit of research because I know I don't have the deep knowledge that you have of King, so I was kind of like looking into it a little bit more, and I realized like, wow, like there's just so much stuff and so many different genres. I mean, he's primarily known as horror, but I mean he's done so many different genres, and I got the sense too. It almost seems now with where things are with all these new social media or new platforms that people use for streaming, it almost seemed like every other week there's some kind of new adaptation. Like
Yeah.
he seems more prolific now. He's got like
Oh yeah.
80 to 100
as
books.
far as he's prolific as a more and more as a writer. Every year he's coming out with more stuff, and in the last 10 years they've actually started putting some money into his films too, and doing series and stuff like that.
So he's like essentially bigger than ever right now in the last few years.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't even want to think about what his net worth could be.
We watched, I can't remember the name of it, but we watched a fairly recent one recently here at your place.
Yeah, Mr. Harrigan's Phone.
And that was pretty interesting.
It was,
and it
was an interesting movie.
It wasn't an all-out, horror. It was more psychological thriller to a degree, but it was
with a little bit of like supernatural horror element to it, but it's pretty played down in that movie.
Would you say, like, I know you love lots of other things in the genre that are not Stephen King. Would you say like Stephen King was kind of that? He was like that gateway creative force that
to the adult stuff for sure. Yeah.
Right, that makes sense.
But I would say more so that that the Alvin Schwartz books of short stories were more of my gateway. R.L. Stine and Goosebumps to a degree, but those only offer what they offer. I mean, I'm sure a lot of the viewers are probably familiar with that stuff, and it is what it is. It's scary for a little kid, but it's not really masterful storytelling, and it's not exactly classic folklore kind of stuff like the Alvin Schwartz books are. The Alvin Schwartz books are basically a compilation and rewriting of a lot of classic horror folk.
Interesting.
But yeah, as I got into my preteens and started getting introduced to Stephen King works, I'm not sure what the first book of his that I ever read was.
For some reason I can remember the first one. I remember Pet Sematary was the first book I read of his.
Wow, that's a heavy hitter to start with.
I remember reading it at a pretty young age, and I remember my family's had like ties. I mean, you grew up in Maine, and my family has had ties to Maine for a long time. We used to have a camp when I was in middle school. We used to have a camp. My mom and dad built a camp up in Island Falls, so we used to come up here a lot. It wasn't until I graduated high school and went to college in the late 90s that my folks moved here. But we used to come up every summer, and I remember on one of the trips to camp, on school break or summer vacation, I would, cruise. We had a little boat, and I would cruise around the lake and with my little Walkman cassettes. And I remember reading Pet Sematary, and I remember it definitely terrified me. And then the other movie, or the other thing that I remember, and I haven't seen it in so long, but the film adaptation, the original Pet Sematary, I think I remember that being really good. I'd like to see that again.
Oh man, it's such a killer film.
But the other one I remember that was not even just for Stephen King, but in general for me, as far as horror, like the impact of how a film could like affect somebody, was Salem's Lot. I remember particularly around the scene where there's the two children, and the one kid is in the bedroom, and then the other kid I believe he gets turned to a vampire, and he goes to the kid's house, but there's a whole scene where he's like floating outside
the window.
And I remember that was one of my earliest recollections of like horror as a kid, seeing that on TV, and it was like it literally gave me nightmares for weeks on end. It was terrifying, but yet I was like, I want to have this experience, because even at that age, It was like being on a roller coaster. You know.
Yeah. I have similar feelings about the Pet Sematary movie.
Not the horrible remake.
Not the recent 2017 or whatever.
Pretty much
whenever
unwatchable.
It was. Yeah, it was so bad. And I had such high hopes for that too.
Yeah.
Like the trailers looked like they totally nailed it, but then they like completely gutted the work.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, the first the '90s adaptation of Pet Sematary, man, that was such a heavy hitting horror movie when I was a kid. For me, like I remember the first probably 5 or 6 times I tried to watch it when I was younger. I had to shut it off because it was so fucking scary.
Yeah, the imagery, and I remember even too, like at a young age, and I think even now, like the kind of the questions that movie raises as far as like your, like your relationship with your family and what you
And
would
mortality.
do, and mortality, and what
Yeah.
you would do to try to, preserve that family unit.
And that's what the
And-
book's about.
And it's pretty heavy duty. And I remember even at a young age, like like it not only was it visually terrifying, but I remember those questions being raised were
Just as terrifying.
just as terrifying.
scary.
And they were kind of like steeped in, to a degree, like real world application, and
Yeah.
it was pretty heavy.
Yeah, I
heavy duty.
think the first time I had to shut it off was when the kid gets hit by the semi,
Yep. Yeah.
and then I think I was able to make it through that scene maybe, and then there was another scene with the wife's sister, the flashbacks with the wife's sister.
Yeah.
Oh
Totally.
my God,
Totally.
so just
Yeah.
gut wrenching.
And I remember during that time I was a big fan of the Munsters TV show,
Yeah.
which Rob Zombie just, I guess, did a remake or a live action.
I've never actually seen the original Monsters.
And yeah, it's great. It's like super campy, but I remember loving it as a kid. That and the Addams Family, the original. And I remember, was it Fred Gwynn who played Herman Munster was in the original Pet Sematary?
Yeah, he plays Judd.
And I remember when I saw that he was in that as a kid before I'd seen it, I was like, that drew me in even more. And I remember he
Don't
gets
want to
this,
go
like,
down that road.
he gets his throat slit, and
Yeah.
it's pretty gruesome. And I remember too, the gore factor for that film too was pretty intense, even for back then, and even probably by today's standards. It was.
Yeah, sometimes I love like the slightly cheesier gore stuff in those lower budget '90s horror movies.
Yeah, absolutely.
More than I love the really polished stuff that's coming out now, because sometimes you inject too much CGI into the movement of a monster, for example, and it takes a lot of that herky jerkiness out of it, and sometimes you want that, and that kind of visual.
Yeah, exactly.
Visual scare is like so much more valuable.
Like I'm a big fan of CGI too, but I'm really, at the end of the day, I'm like a practical. I'm a big fan of like the practical effects. Like one movie or example or artist I can think of is Rob Bottin, who did the effects for John Carpenter's The Thing. Like it's all in camera.
Yeah.
And and it's there's something about it where you can kind of like it's tactile. It's got this thing where you feel like you can touch it, and it's been lived in.
Yeah.
There can be good CGI, usage. I was just talking about. I think one good modern example. Like I started another series on the channel covering the Avenger movies, and I just finished Infinity War, I think that's a really great, example of that. Or the first three, Peter Jackson adaptations of Lord of the Rings.
Oh yeah.
But it's, where it's pretty seamless, but it's pretty hit or miss.
They
I
also
think.
did a lot with makeup in those movies.
Yeah,
those
there's a
Peter
lot.
Jackson
There's a lot
movies,
more, and there's
which
actually
I
a
think
lot of
makes it
real
so much more
locations.
kick-ass than the Hobbit movies.
Yeah,
The
there's a
fact
lot
that,
of
like,
real locations too.
a
So
lot of those orcs were people in makeup and
Yep.
armor, as opposed to the Hobbit when you go to the Misty Mountains and they get ambushed by the goblins. All those goblins are just little CGI blobs.
so yeah, there's that. It creates that that sense of, I don't know, as a viewer when you see the practical effects. At least it does for me. There's like a sense of just realism in that. Another really one of my favorite makeup artists, Tom Savini, who like was responsible for a lot of the amazing slasher films in the 70s and 80s, most notably known for like the Friday the 13th movies. But it's all like in camera and just just it just adds this rawness, and it was always like, I like I talk about The Thing and Rob Bottin, who went on to direct The Howling, which I think is probably my favorite werewolf movie. But it gives you, as a viewer, even now, when I see a lot of those films, a sense of wonder, like, how did they do that? Like, how the hell did they pull this off? As compared to, say, CGI that's not done so well, where it just kind of glazes over you,
Yeah.
and it doesn't have that that thing, that grit to it, where this was all conceived out of someone's brain, and they had to figure out a way how to put these things together in real time, and they don't have very much of the budgets are pretty minuscule, and how because of the setup time and how complex it is, they need to get shit right within 2 or 3 takes, because if they don't, they lose money. And so it's a very different
Yeah.
very different thing. And I know we talked about it before with like with what I try to do with this channel is talk about music things. For me, I like talk a lot about my electronic group Quantum, and how it's another, for me, it's a real big source. Film is tremendous source of inspiration for that band, and you had mentioned too that you're very much inspired by a lot of the same aesthetics for your
Totally.
writing. So
Totally.
I'd love for you to. We haven't really talked about that so much. If you want to dig into that, I know
Well-
some of the lyrics. Like, it's funny because we've played music now for a long time, and I don't remember. It wasn't all that long ago. I think we were rehearsing. At my house, and I think you and Rick McKellen, who also plays guitar in Split Willow, and we can't forget Kara, who's on. Amazing people we get to play with. But I remember you and Rick were talking about some of the lyrics in one of the songs, and I remember you were explaining it, and I was like, wow, I didn't really, for some reason, pick up on that before. And I was like, that's really interesting, where you were coming from for certain lyrics for Split Willow.
Yeah. So some of my lyrics are, there's at least a couple that are definitely straight up Stephen King references.
Hmm.
There's
Like from actual books of his or films.
Yeah, I don't think they're actually like quotes that I pulled, but they're references for sure. Like at the end of Echoes of Fire, when yellow turns to blue as it designs its disguise, and that all the imagery with like the paper boat going down the currents of the gutter and stuff like that. That's all about the beginning of it.
Oh, okay. Very
with
cool.
with Georgie chasing the paper boat down the drain.
Wild.
And also there's a subtle Algernon Blackwood reference in Ode to Today. Algernon Blackwood wrote The Wendigo, which is a very old horror short story about the North American woods and Native American kind of demon spirit that's chasing these hunters around out there. It's a pretty badass story. It's a classic for sure. Actually, there's a extremely abridged adaptation of it in Alvin Schwartz's books.
Interesting. I remember too. I remember before it was when kind of when I started playing with you guys again and in this new configuration. I remember seeing. I remember one of the things that stood out to me was I felt like, which is kind of my first impression, that the music had very much more of a Pink Floyd influence, but then I also thought some of the music had a little bit of a darker, literary kind of vibe to it.
Yeah.
At times, it had different shades that weren't there before. Because the Mullet Makers was a great band, but I kind of look back at that as like it was kind of a party band,
pretty much like a party jam band kind of thing, and very improvised too.
Very much, yeah, very much so. But look back at that band as like, had a good ride, and it was a great learning experience, and we had some good gigs, and it was always fun and crazy, but it was just like a little bit more of just like a party, drinking band.
Yeah, well,
in regards to what
I was drinking a lot back then, so I quit drinking right after I kind of like, or it was right before I kind of made the decision to like really kind of split the band up and try to reform it and do something else. And we stayed under that name for a while after that happened, and had a lot of member shuffling going on.
Yeah, lots
and
lot
then
of
the
different
pandemic
changes.
happened
right
after that, and that really threw a wrench in the gears for
I think I remember seeing it right when the pandemic was happening. I think I remember seeing an interview during that time, actually with Stephen King, and he was talking about. I think it was during the time of like the height of the lockdown, and he had said something in this interview where he's like, I never thought one of my, I would be experiencing something that I had written about I'd be experiencing in real life terms, as far as like their kind of the horrific, psychological effect that had on a lot of people. Or the climate of, how that just changed everything for, well, probably forever, but especially at that time. Do you have like, been getting back to Stephen King, like a top tier of like your go-to books or films, and if you want to share this amazing
I've got
altar of King here.
It's a very small collection. It's I do have a couple of these first editions, which is pretty cool. The Dead Zone and the Firestarter. But I just pulled out whatever VHSs I had and whatever DVDs I have. We have it up here twice. And we've got my Stephen King shirts that I got at Spencer's Gifts.
So cool. Yeah,
the Creep Show and the Red Rum. But my go-to, it has always been a go-to for me, Tim Curry as the clown, and so much great young talent in this movie, a young Seth Green. And
when not to interrupt you, but when I went to my first horror convention about a month ago up in Bangor. They had the original cast from the movie was there.
No shit.
From it. Yeah, it was pretty cool.
That's awesome. Yeah, I love that adaptation, though it may not be faithful to the book, which I might be of the school of thought that it's impossible to be faithful to the book.
How did you feel about the fairly recent remakes with was it Peter Sarsgaard?
Bill Skarsgård.
Bill Skarsgård.
Yeah, so I think he did a pretty good job playing Pennywise.
Yep. He was pretty frightening.
He was pretty frightening. I thought that the first movie, Chapter 1, was pretty good. As I've seen it multiple times since then, like, yeah, there's tons of stuff about it that I pick apart because I'm so attached to King's universe and his work.
We saw the second one.
We did
in the theater,
and it took a minute for it to sink in after we saw it, and then I remember turning to you in the car and being like, I don't think I liked it.
yeah, I was kind of disappointed with how I thought it started off with a bang, and then I feel like it was pretty anticlimactic and got pretty cluttered.
It was very cluttered,
kind of silly towards the end.
Super silly, and I just don't like what they did with the source material. I guess because it's a pretty far fling from what happens in the book, you know. And I also really didn't like the spider clown thing at the end.
Yeah, that was that was kind of what forced me to kind of check out.
Yeah. And I had really high hopes for it too, because they did get some really heavy hitting actors, some actors that I'm like a big fan of to do stuff in that movie. Jessica Chastain as older Beverly, and Bill Hader as Richie Tozier. I mean, I love Bill Hader, man. Yeah. He's hilarious. He's great.
Yeah.
And he's also got good dramatic chops. He's not just a funny guy. He is a funny guy, but he's also like a seriously great actor too. I think the only casting choice that I wasn't that happy with was James McAvoy. I'm not that big of a fan of James McAvoy.
Is there I don't know if you know of any other plans right now for them to make any more kind of big screen adaptations of any of his films, like the size or scope of what they did with it?
So Gary Doberman's working on Salem's Lot.
Wow, like a remake.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And I think Gary Doberman's the guy who did it, Chapter 1 and 2. So we'll see. I'm hoping that it's going to be awesome. Because there's so much, there's so much that you could do with that little section of Stephen King's universe.
Right.
Universe. Because when we started talking about doing this show, you remember I sent you a couple of, because we immediately started
Jerusalem's Lot,
riffing about Salem's Lot. So I sent you a couple of short stories that are linked to the lot. One that's like a way before, in the 1800s, kind of not quite origin story for the lot, but it's got some of the lot's origins in it for sure.
Yeah, I thought that one, the short one, that one was amazing. Yeah. I thought that was just tremendous.
Jerusalem's Lot, and I mean the narrator for that one is great, and they've got like a little bit of like score going on in the background in some spots too. I love that when they do that with audiobooks. And then the second one that I sent you, I don't know if you got to finish it, but was One for the Road, which is like post Salem's Lot novel. It's like a few years down the line. After the town burns.
Yeah, I haven't checked that one out yet, but I definitely want to.
It's good. But yeah, I mean, I'm hoping that adaptation, it'd be really cool if they incorporated some of the ideas from Jerusalem's Lot into the film adaptation of Salem's Lot that's coming out, or that's being worked on. I doubt that they will. Just because somebody else might have the rights to it, because they've been doing this show Chapel Flight with Adrian Brody. that's based off of the Jerusalem's Lot.
Huh. It's
Short
I
story.
guess it's based more or less off of the short story of Jerusalem.
Yeah, yeah.
I think you
And
said it wasn't very good.
I saw like the first episode or two. I didn't love it. It didn't have the authenticity of a period piece that I'm really looking for. It felt a little. It felt like you were on a film set watching it. So
Yeah, that was the thing I was taken back by
immersion breaking, you know.
by listening to the short story was just the imagery that it just conjured up.
It's very Dracula too, the way that it's written, because it's all in like journal entries and letters.
Yeah, it kind of blew me away how great it was. I remember listening. It was a short piece, but I listened to it right away and I was just totally hooked.
It's like Dracula meets H.P. Lovecraft.
Very much had a Lovecraftian vibe to it.
Yeah.
Are there any other I don't know, writers that you're always checking out or you're as stoked about? Or even if it's even stuff that's non-horror based.
Well, I mean, like I said, horror is just dark fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been on a huge George R.R. Martin kick for a while now, since last year when my girlfriend finally convinced me to watch Game of Thrones. So I watched all that and I became completely obsessed with it. And
what's Game of Thrones? I never heard of it.
But now the new spin-off show has come out, House of the Dragon, which is a prequel to the original show. It takes place a couple hundred years beforehand. And
it's a prequel for.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
And I've been reading the book that this show's based off of, Fire and Blood. And that's been a really fun rabbit hole to
Does it
dive
have
down.
the same kind of like violent and sexual
Very
nature?
much so, yeah. Yeah, well, the show does, for sure. The book is definitely violent, and it reads more like a history book, though, so it's not as nitty-gritty and sexual as the shows. Because the shows, they really play that up. I think that's a selling point.
Yeah, I have. And as far as Game of Thrones, I have a lot of work to do. I've only seen probably the third up until the third season. I know it's been on for 20 years.
Yeah, well, I mean that's
So
the golden
What?
spot for that show. Anyways, I mean after the fourth season, it kind of went downhill.
Yeah, I've heard from folks that was that was the case. And fairly recently, I was at Goodwill and they had the entire first season for like $1 or something, and I picked it up on DVD. So one of these days.
Yeah.
I
Let me
generally
know, 'cause we could do a whole show about
Yeah,
that.
generally I mostly watch movies. A lot of times I have a hard time, even though there's so many amazing, great television shows. But a lot of times I have a problem with, I don't know if it's my attention or something, but staying with. I'm not really a binge watcher, I guess, per se, of movies. Of television shows. Like, I can watch numerous movies back to back, but it's a little bit of a different experience for me. But I get the attraction and the allure because there's so many. There's so many things out there. So it's always, kind of a case of. Eventually, I'll get to them, and I'll eventually see it. A couple of shows that I've been really loving. We've talked a lot about it too. Is like the first season of True Detective.
Oh yeah.
I really love was it Manhunt, the Unabomber.
Oh, that was
series.
super good too.
Really love that. And recently, I just bought on DVD the Wire, which was an old school HBO cop show, which was really great. But there's so many. You're always telling me about a lot of shows. So
yeah, I binge watch
Mm-hmm.
Netflix and HBO and Hulu shows all the time.
So like being that you're a younger kid or guy in this generation, who kind of grew up with, technology and where now people's habits are very different. I mean, we still go to the movies quite a bit, but overall, things are very different now with the industry, with streaming, and also, and I know you view a lot of content and you love a lot of stuff and you're pretty passionate about it. How do you feel like? I don't know. Where do you see the whole thing going? Because I know recently the last Halloween movie, Halloween Ends, it just came out. They released it, and it's been a thing now where they released it in theaters, and then it was on Peacock. When it was released. So that seems to be a trend, but I don't know. Is it something you think about, or where do you see that going as far as how how people will access content or watch content in the future, or is that do you see it being a negative thing that could affect the industry as a whole, or a positive thing? I mean, being that it's like a generational thing for you.
I think it definitely we're definitely seeing the effect of it. I mean, especially since the pandemic. Yeah, less people are wanting to go out to the movies. And, I mean, you see kind of a decline in the quality of service at a lot of, corporate movie theaters and stuff now.
Mm-hmm.
Not so much in more built-up areas, but in, the smaller areas, like we're in, the rural areas that we're in. You have to drive pretty far to get to a theater that's maybe not that great.
Yep.
I won't name any names, but one of our local theaters, it usually has some sound issues or issues with the picture.
Right.
It's normally really dirty in there. It's, it's not great. But, and I feel like some of that is lack of desire to go out and spend the money when you could just watch it at home on a streaming service.
Right.
But I think to a degree that the silver screen and the movie theater will probably never go away. I mean, when we've got stuff like IMAX and things like that are and 3D movies and things like that are
an immersive,
truly immersive experience.
Right.
People are gonna want that. People are gonna want to go into a huge dark room,
Mm-hmm.
getting
Absolutely.
hit by the sound waves and feeling like things are coming out at you from the screen. It's an amusement park ride.
Absolutely.
So we're always going to have that, I'm sure.
Yeah, one director who I love, who's one of my favorite directors, Denis Villeneuve, he just recently, last year came up with the adaptation of Dune. He's done the Blade Runner 2049 and so many great movies, and he's like a major player, and I think they filmed the second chapter to Dune this past summer, so that's coming out, and that was a huge hit, surprisingly so in a lot of ways. But he's pretty set in his ways, and pretty steadfast about. Well, he makes these movies because he wants people to go to the theater. He wants people to have that experience, like that collective, because it's an ancient kind of ritualistic thing in our DNA of going to a dark space, and you could have that transcending experience with strangers in a dark place, and you forget, you leave the mundane for 2 hours, and then it in some ways could change your way of thinking, or you could just have a real experience,
or you could be totally underwhelmed.
Yeah, but I remember him saying that he kind of refused to move to a place of where where only people are going to watch films in this format or not, but it's because he wants that true experience. But which I think is commendable, and I kind of agree with him. But at the same time, you can't slow. Technology is not going to stop, and it's a way of adapting
Yeah.
as
Also, the
things
medium
change.
is
I mean,
like
for music too. I mean,
the
for what we're
medium is
doing.
changing so much too with storytelling, as far as like film storytelling, because of streaming services and um, episodic format, doing miniseries,
Right.
which I think is great, but you can't really put a miniseries in the theater,
Exactly.
because it's like, who's gonna keep coming to see episode after episode?
Right.
I mean, I guess you could, but it doesn't. It doesn't seem like it would work to me. But
And it's it's kind of funny too with like people's like a lot of the films that I cover on this channel and in my pages, like I do try to do all kinds of movies, but horror based movies, but been doing a lot of like kind of the grindhouse exploitation movies, and to think of like like I'd seen this great documentary a few years ago, or actually for release really recently on 42nd Street in the 70s and 80s, and basically like it was these old theaters that were falling apart in New York, and you would pay a ticket and you'd go in and see like 5 movies in a row, and and it was like equivalent to I guess what people would be doing now with quote unquote binge watching. It wasn't a thing, so it was a very different time, but yeah. Is closing up on an hour here. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about? This has been. Thanks again for doing this. This is
this is
super
great.
super fun, and I'm excited to get this out there.
I can't really think of anything else that I really want to touch on without doing like really deep dives into stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, as far as King fanatics go, be on the lookout for the Gary Doberman Salem's Lot.
When is there time frame when it might
I
be?
think 2023 is what they're looking at. Maybe not until 2024, but I think 2023. Also, not sure when it'll happen. Maybe I guess it probably won't happen until next year, 2023. Mike Flanagan's coming out with another one of his miniseries adaptations, starring Mark Hamill,
Huh.
who played Luke Skywalker in Star Wars, for those of you who don't know that. Follow the House of Usher, Edgar Allan Poe.
Really?
Yeah, but there'll probably be a whole lot of other Poe things rolled into it, because that's kind of what Mike Flanagan does. Mike Flanagan has adapted several Stephen King works at this point. He did the Netflix Gerald's Game.
Yeah, he's one of the best working directors.
He's
in horror,
amazing.
I think
And
in general.
also he did Doctor Sleep, the sequel to The Shining, that I recently saw an interview with him where he was talking about Stephen King and talking about that, and how he got Stephen King's permission to make it a film sequel to the Kubrick film that Stephen King famously disliked.
Right.
But the way that Flanagan pitched it to him and wanted to weave the Kubrick film into King's sequel novel, Stephen was okay with it.
I remember being so surprised and blown away by that movie, because not only like doing something as ambitious as that was, and how it just tied in, because there's people who like the movie and the book, or and it can be polarizing, I guess, especially with Stephen King himself, but the way they were able to kind of reach both of those audiences, and yet it was like really cohesive, and I was just, and so ambitious, and I thought it was any less of a skilled director, no way. That was something else.
Yeah.
But thanks again, man. This
Thanks
has
for
been
having me on,
total
man.
blast.
Yeah,
And
we should do
we'll
it again.
We'll do this again. So this is Jason Dean at Film Fanatic. So if you get a chance, please like and subscribe to my wacky videos, and we'll see you. We'll see you next time. All right, peace.